I stood there with the Arizona heat pressing down on me, sweat clinging to my back like a second skin, watching the dust swirl around my shoes. The sun beat hard on the Wells Fargo branch, the red paint faded and the windows dull like the eyes of someone who'd seen too much and forgotten why it mattered. I had $47 in my account and a duffel bag slung over my shoulder, filled with whatever I could grab in 10 angry minutes before Cassandra told me she'd called a locksmith. 15 years of marriage, gone in 3 days. Just like that. No warning, no build-up. She said she was done, and she meant it. I didn't have a lawyer. I didn't have a friend in that moment. What I did have was a card, old, scratched, something I'd carried so long it had become invisible in my wallet. It had been 23 years since I last saw my mother. I mean really saw her. She'd looked like a ghost the last few weeks, all bone and breath. The hospital lights had washed her out, and every time I blinked, she seemed thinner, less there. On her final day, she pressed the card into my hand, barely able to close my fingers around it. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her eyes were wide open and steady. "Only when you truly have nothing left," she said, and then her eyes closed for the last time. I never used the card. I'd stared at it plenty over the years, usually when bills piled up or things got tight. But I always told myself I hadn't hit bottom yet. Not really. Even when my business failed, even when we sold the lake house. Not yet. Today, though, standing outside that forgotten branch, I finally understood what she meant. I had nothing left. Not pride, not hope, not even a real place to sleep. So I walked up to the ATM, pulled out the card, and hesitated. The thing barely slid in, it was so worn the machine probably thought it was trash. I typed in the PIN, 4 digits burned into my memory like a scar, and waited for the usual screen to appear. But instead of the normal banking options, the machine froze. Then it beeped. Not the usual quick beep, but one long, high-pitched sound that made me glance over my shoulder. I looked around, confused, half expecting the thing to eat the card. Instead, a message popped up, "Please wait. Assistance required." That's when the ATM screen turned blue, and I heard the lock of the bank doors click open. The manager was a thin man in a gray suit too big for his frame. He opened the door, looking like he expected to see a thief or a malfunction. He stepped outside, eyes scanning me up and down, then back to the machine. "Sir? Did you just use an emergency access card?" I had no idea what that even meant. I told him it belonged to my mother, handed him my ID, and followed him inside because he asked me to, or rather, told me to, in a voice that didn't leave room for refusal. The air conditioning hit me like a punch. The lobby was empty, the lights flickering slightly like they hadn't been changed in years. The carpet smelled faintly of mildew and something older I couldn't quite place. He brought me into a small office behind a glass door, sat me down, then disappeared for 10 full minutes. I sat there, my duffel bag on the floor, staring at the cheap paintings on the wall and wondering if I'd somehow triggered a fraud alert. When he came back, his face was pale. He was holding a sealed envelope in one hand and a black binder in the other. He set them both down in front of me like they were fragile. "Mr. Blake," he said carefully, this card is tied to a legacy trust. One that's been dormant for 23 years. You were flagged as the sole beneficiary in the event that the card was ever used." I blinked at him, trying to understand what I was hearing. A trust? He slid the binder toward me, and I opened it slowly. Inside were pages, copies of handwritten letters, legal documents, bank statements. The last one was recent. Dated only 3 months ago. It listed an account balance I couldn't process at first. I had to read it twice. Then a third time. $9,472,000. I laughed. Out loud. Not because it was funny, because it wasn't, but because I didn't know what else to do. He didn't laugh. He just pushed the envelope toward me. Inside, I found another note. My mother's handwriting. Faded, but familiar. "If you found this, then it means the world failed you in ways I hoped it never would. But I always believed in you. You were meant for more than surviving. Use this to become the man I knew you could be." I sat there, reading the note again and again, while the manager made calls and arranged meetings I didn't understand. The air felt heavy. The past, the present, all of it colliding in that one tiny, faded branch where nothing ever seemed to happen. Until now. 72 hours earlier, I was still living in what I thought was my home, the place I had helped build, one room at a time, over a decade and a half. It was a Friday morning, sun coming through the tall windows of our minimalist kitchen, Cassandra's favorite espresso already cold beside her tablet. She was standing at the counter, tapping out furious emails, talking to herself about lab trials and market positions, her tone clipped and precise, the way it always got before quarterly shareholder meetings. I was in my home office, grading papers while listening for her usual call when she needed me to look over her slides or rehearse a pitch. Only this time, she didn't ask. She barked out my name like a command, didn't even look up when I walked in. She shoved a printed deck into my hands and told me to fix the flow before noon. That was her phrase, not edit, not review. Fix. I remember feeling that quiet sting I'd grown too familiar with over the last couple years. We'd stopped being partners long ago. I was an accessory to her ambition, something she could use and relegate back to the background. Still, I sat at my desk, went through her presentation line by line, tightened the language, cleaned up the numbers, suggested better framing for the clinical trial updates. I knew her tone, her rhythms, the way she liked to present confidence through understated certainty. I'd done it 100 times before. It was just before lunch when I went upstairs. I was looking for my phone charger, but when I stepped into our bedroom, I stopped cold. There they were. Divorce papers. Perfectly aligned on my pillow, like some twisted hotel turndown service. I remember standing there, blinking, trying to understand what I was looking at. Pages upon pages, tabs for signatures, highlighted fields. I didn't hear her come up behind me until her reflection appeared in the mirror. She was in the doorway, arms folded, one heel propped against the frame like this was just another item on her schedule. "You're not enough for me anymore," she said. No emotion. No cruelty, even. Just cold detachment, like she was delivering a lab result. Then, as if the blade hadn't gone deep enough, she added, "You're embarrassing." I turned to look at her, still trying to catch up. Embarrassing? I wanted to laugh. What had I done? I taught literature. I helped her edit her damn speeches. I'd hosted her board dinners, poured wine for investors, smiled at venture capitalists whose names I was never supposed to remember. I paid the bills on time, remembered her mother's birthday, backed out of publishing my own novel because the timing conflicted with her company's Series C launch. But somehow, I was the one who had fallen short. That afternoon blurred. Her lawyer, Gordon Avery, an expensive, predatory man with a voice like a threat, called me from a blocked number. His tone was almost celebratory. I wasn't even allowed to enter the office again without supervision. She had changed the home alarm code. My access to our shared accounts was gone before I finished listening to his voicemail. She offered me a $50,000 exit gift, as if I'd been a temp worker at her firm instead of her husband. Gordon made it clear, sign the agreement, leave quietly, and I could walk away without being buried in legal hell. I signed it. I don't even know why. Maybe it was the way she looked at me, like a stain she wanted scrubbed out of her perfect life. Maybe it was because I didn't want to beg. Or maybe because some part of me had died long before that Friday morning, and I hadn't noticed until the papers made it real. That night I slept on a friend's couch, the duffel bag already half-packed. I didn't have the energy to tell anyone what happened. There was no custody battle, no assets to negotiate. She had structured our entire life to keep me out of the inner circle. Everything was in her name, the house, the vehicles, the investment portfolio. Even our marriage certificate was framed and stored in her study, as if she owned the story of us. I stared at the ceiling most of that night, wondering how a life so full of intention could feel so disposable in the end. How someone who once cried in my arms over a failed product trial now saw me as an obstacle to be cleared. I thought about the years I spent making sure she didn't fall apart. I thought about how she introduced me at corporate events. "This is Jonathan, he teaches high school English," always with a half-smile that told the listener she married down, but with grace. And now I was gone from her world with a single conversation, a single envelope, a single name on the dotted line. She didn't just divorce me. She erased me. The motel Gordon Avery had arranged for me was the kind of place that didn't bother hiding what it was. A 2-story slab of peeling stucco off the I-10, sagging under the weight of its own neglect. The neon sign blinked half dead, casting a dull pink glow over the cracked parking lot and oil-stained pavement. Room 116 smelled like bleach and old cigarettes, the kind of smell that clung to the walls long after the last guest had stopped smoking. The carpet was a patternless brown blur, worn thin in the places people paced when they were too anxious to sleep. The bed creaked every time I shifted, the springs whining like they were in pain. I didn't unpack much, just shoved my duffel bag into the corner and dropped the check on the nightstand. $50,000. That was her idea of closure. A golden handshake for a man she no longer wanted in the picture. I stared at that check like it might burst into flames, like it could explain to me how 15 years of marriage had come to a figure that wouldn't even cover a year's rent in most decent parts of Phoenix. The vending machine by the front office had 3 working rows. I bought a packet of stale peanuts and a soda that tasted like rust. The Wi-Fi barely worked, and even when it did, I couldn't bring myself to open my laptop. I didn't want to check my email, didn't want to see the auto-forwarded legal notices or financial lockouts. Cassandra had made sure that everything was handled before I'd even stepped out the door. The woman didn't do anything halfway, especially erasing me. By the 3rd day, I'd stopped trying to sleep. I just lay there, watching the ceiling, following the cracks with my eyes like they were maps leading somewhere else. Somewhere better. My body was tired, but my mind wouldn't quit. It kept replaying her voice, that flat, dismissive tone, over and over. "You're embarrassing." I wondered how long she'd been rehearsing it. How long she'd known she was going to end it. The room felt like a box closing in on me. The air conditioning clanked and sputtered every few minutes, blasting out air that smelled faintly of mold. I had nothing but time to think about my life, my choices, how easily I'd let her control the narrative. And then, in that low, quiet moment between night and morning, something surfaced in my mind like a ripple breaking still water. The card. It had been buried in my wallet so long it was almost part of the lining. I hadn't thought about it in years. Not seriously. I'd always carried it like a token, something sentimental, something sacred in a strange way. My mother, Linda Blake, had given it to me on the last day I saw her alive. Her hand was shaking, her eyes sunken but fierce. I remember every word she said, "Only when you have nothing." And maybe this was what she meant. A rundown motel, a check I hadn't even cashed, a heart still bleeding from the blade my wife had so cleanly slid between the ribs. No job. No home. No future I could see. I got dressed in the same jeans and shirt I'd worn 2 days ago, brushed my teeth in a cracked mirror, and walked out into the early morning heat. Phoenix doesn't give you gentle mornings, just thinner heat before it thickens. I drove my rusted-out Corolla, the one asset she didn't want, to a Wells Fargo branch I barely remembered existed. It was tucked between an abandoned strip mall and a shuttered gas station, the kind of place that looked like it had stopped keeping up sometime in the 90s. I parked under a dying palm tree and just sat there for a minute, staring at the building. There was nothing special about it. Dusty windows. Faded signage. But my hands were sweating as I pulled out the card. It was cracked down the center, edges frayed, magnetic strip nearly rubbed clean. I ran my thumb over it once, then stepped out into the heat. The ATM was old, real buttons, faded numbers. I fed the card in, half expecting it to spit it back out. But it took it. The screen lit up. Enter PIN. I hesitated. My mother's birthday? Our old house number? Then I remembered what she whispered after giving it to me. Use your birthday. You'll never forget. So I did. Month. Day. Year. 4 digits. Then the screen changed. No menu. No options. Just one message. Please wait. Assistance required. Then a long, piercing beep. Not angry. Not broken. Just, alert. I turned around, expecting someone to tell me I broke the machine. Instead, I saw a man in a gray suit hurrying toward the door. The man who opened the door for me looked like he hadn't slept in days. His nameplate read Marvin Chen, and his hands were trembling slightly as he asked me to follow him. I expected a reprimand or maybe some vague explanation about system glitches, but there was something in his eyes that stopped me cold. Not irritation. Not confusion. Fear, maybe. Or awe. He kept glancing at the screen behind the teller window like it had shown him a ghost. We didn't go to the customer service counter. He brought me through a hallway lined with dusty plaques and into a small private office that smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner. The blinds were drawn, the chair cushions cracked from years of use. Marvin shut the door quietly, then sat down across from me like he was preparing to deliver bad news. He cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, then stared down at the papers in front of him. "Mr. Blake," he said carefully, "I need to confirm some details with you before I go any further." He asked for my ID, took note of the card I'd used, then typed something into his terminal with deliberate slowness. As he scrolled, his lips parted slightly, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then he looked up, his voice lower than before. "This account, it's showing a balance of $47.3 million. I just stared at him. My mouth opened, but no words came out. I actually laughed, short, breathless, the kind of laugh you give when you've misunderstood something wildly. "That's not possible," I said. My mom was a bookkeeper. She lived in a 2-bedroom duplex. She drove a 2001 Honda. But Marvin didn't blink. He turned the monitor toward me, the number glowing on the screen, solid and undeniable. $47,312,000, with change. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake. Some sort of database error, a glitch triggered by an ancient card. But Marvin leaned forward, his fingers steepled, and began to explain. He said the account wasn't just a savings account. It was tied to a dormant investment trust, a kind of financial time capsule, triggered only by a very specific set of conditions. The original deposit had been made in 1983 in the amount of $50,000. The name attached to it, Linda Blake. My mother. The trust had been managed privately, through a firm I'd never heard of, Bright River Capital. Marvin explained that Bright River had been one of the earliest venture firms on the West Coast, long since dissolved, but not before making early, substantial investments in companies that would become household names. Apple. Cisco. Google. I sat there, trying to understand how any of this made sense. My mother never talked about investments. She never spoke of stocks or venture anything. She had worked at a local accountant's office for most of her life, wore the same 3 pairs of shoes, and bought groceries with coupons until the day she died. There were no clues. No hints of secret wealth. I remembered her measuring out cans of soup in the last year of her life so she could afford her medications. How could she have left behind this? Then Marvin reached into a locked drawer and pulled out a worn brown envelope with my name on it, written in slanted, careful handwriting I hadn't seen in over 20 years. It stopped my breath. I took it from him slowly, hands shaking, and opened it like it was made of glass. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. It was a letter. Jonathan, if you're reading this, then you've done exactly what I hoped you'd never have to do. You used the card. That means the world has taken everything from you, and that breaks my heart, even now. I invested that money a long time ago, money I didn't have, honestly, because someone I trusted told me the world was going to change, and I believed them. I didn't know if it would work. I didn't know if it would matter. But I wanted something to be there if life ever cornered you. I know you, John. You're kind. You're patient. You give people the benefit of the doubt even when they don't deserve it. And the world, it doesn't always reward that. So I wanted to. I wanted to make sure you had something if everything else disappeared. But I also wanted you to live your life without leaning on this. I wanted you to work, to love, to try. I wanted you to be the man I saw every day in our tiny kitchen, reading with your mouth open, scribbling poetry on the back of gas bills. You were always enough. Always. And if you're reading this, then it means someone made you feel otherwise. Let this be a reminder that they were wrong. I read the letter 3 times before I could even lift my head. Marvin gave me space, stepping out of the room, leaving me alone with the sound of my breath and the soft rustle of the paper in my hands. My mother, who had died with less than a dozen people at her funeral, who had made casseroles stretch across a week, who never once complained about her own suffering, had left behind the kind of wealth most people only dreamed of. And she had done it quietly, without glory, without recognition, and with more love than I'd ever deserved. She hadn't wanted me to touch it unless I truly had no other path left. And now, here I was. No wife. No job. No future. Just a worn duffel bag, a cracked ATM card, and a name I barely recognized in the reflection anymore. But the money was real. And so was the chance to finally begin again. The moment I stepped out of that bank, still reeling from what I'd learned, I knew exactly what I had to do. For the first time in days, my hands were steady. The sun was still punishing, the city still loud and indifferent, but something had shifted in me. I wasn't thinking about the money, not in the way most people might. I wasn't dreaming of mansions or yachts or revenge fantasies. I was thinking about fairness. About truth. About the way Cassandra had looked at me like I was disposable. The way she'd let her lawyer throw those papers at me like a bone to a stray dog. And more than anything, I was thinking about the contract I'd signed under pressure, sitting alone in a motel room, dazed and humiliated. I made one phone call. Deborah Hastings was the name that came up again and again when I searched for high-stakes family law attorneys in Arizona. Not just expensive, surgical. Strategic. Dangerous. Her reputation was carved into court records and whispered in boardrooms. She didn't advertise. She didn't need to. Her hourly rate was $875, and her retainer required wire transfer confirmation before she'd even take a meeting. I paid it in full that same afternoon. I walked into her office the next morning in the same worn clothes I'd been wearing since Cassandra threw me out. Deborah didn't blink. Her office was as stark and intimidating as her reputation: dark wood, black leather chairs, not a single personal photograph on display. She didn't ask how I found her. She didn't ask why I wanted to fight. She simply looked through the scanned divorce agreement I'd forwarded the night before, her red pen scratching across the paper as if it offended her. "This isn't just unconscionable," she said, flipping a page. "It's trash. And your ex-wife's lawyer is a clown." I told her about Gordon Avery, about the way he'd contacted me through a block number, how I wasn't given time to seek counsel, how Cassandra had cornered me emotionally before that check ever touched the nightstand. I told her everything, from the moment I found the papers to the way Cassandra stood in the doorway like a judge handing down a sentence. Deborah didn't ask many questions. She didn't offer sympathy. What she offered was far more useful: action. Within 24 hours, her team had filed a motion to void the divorce agreement. The grounds were solid: coercion, lack of independent legal counsel, imbalance of power, and an unconscionable settlement under Arizona law. They attached a financial analysis comparing my annual income as a high school teacher with Cassandra's compensation package as CEO of a $190 million biotech company. They highlighted the disparity, the pressure, the suddenness. They cited precedent after precedent, cases where similar settlements had been overturned in front of judges who didn't take kindly to manipulation disguised as closure. By the 48-hour mark, Gordon Avery called Deborah directly. He was rattled. I didn't have to hear the conversation to know that. Deborah's voice didn't raise once, but the way she smiled, thin and deliberate, told me everything I needed. When she hung up, she turned to me and said, "He's not used to being outgunned." It was 72 hours after filing when Cassandra found out. According to someone still working at her company, a former assistant of mine who'd become her assistant over the years, she was in a shareholder prep meeting when the call came through. Gordon had tried to buffer the impact, but Cassandra wasn't the type to take surprises well. She hurled her phone across the room. It shattered against a glass wall. The meeting ended in silence. I didn't celebrate. Not really. There was nothing triumphant about watching someone else's mask begin to slip, even if they'd spent years chiseling yours away. But I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Control. Not revenge. Just the simple satisfaction of standing up and not being pushed down again. The best part? I didn't have to do anything loud. The motion itself was enough. It was public record. Her board would see it. Her shareholders. Her inner circle, all the people she used to impress by introducing me as just a teacher. They'd see that I hadn't rolled over. That I had representation now. That I wasn't backing down. And with the kind of resources I now had behind me, I had choices. I wasn't sleeping in motels anymore. I wasn't eating from vending machines. And I wasn't just surviving. I was fighting. On my terms. The courtroom was colder than I expected, all gray walls and polished wood, a kind of sterile order that made it easy to forget how messy everything leading up to that day had been. I arrived early, wearing the only suit I owned, not new, not flashy, but clean and well-fitted. I didn't want to make a statement. I wanted to be seen for who I really was, someone who had been stripped of dignity but hadn't lost his footing. I sat quietly beside Deborah Hastings, who radiated a calm, dangerous focus, flipping through her notes with the casual ease of someone who already knew how this would end. Across the aisle, Cassandra entered exactly as I knew she would, head high, posture sharp, dressed in a luxury ensemble that probably cost more than the car I used to drive. Every piece of her was curated. Her heels clicked with precision, her diamond earrings caught the courtroom lights, and her face wore that same unreadable confidence she used to save for board meetings and investor dinners. But this time, it didn't move me. I didn't feel small anymore. I just felt ready. Judge Maria Goldstein presided, and the moment she entered, the temperature in the room seemed to shift. Her reputation was well known, fair but unyielding, especially when it came to power imbalances, corporate manipulation, or anything that smelled like coercion. She had a long history of leveling the playing field, and today, she wasn't smiling. She looked at the file in front of her for a long moment before addressing the room, her voice firm and low. Deborah started the day like a surgeon with a scalpel. Calm, measured, lethal. She outlined our case with precision: the lack of legal counsel on my end, the sudden nature of the divorce agreement, the grotesque financial disparity, and most of all, the circumstances surrounding my signature, a man, emotionally wrecked, isolated, and pushed into accepting an exit gift under pressure. She spoke without theatrics, her words doing all the cutting. Gordon Avery, sitting across from us with a jaw clenched so tight it looked painful, tried to interject, but Deborah silenced him with a single raised hand and a line that cut the air clean. Mr. Avery will have his chance. For now, the court will hear the facts. Then came the witnesses. Deborah had assembled them carefully. People Cassandra had underestimated, ignored, or forgotten altogether. A former assistant of hers who recalled how I hosted dozens of dinners for biotech investors, often preparing everything myself, greeting guests while Cassandra locked herself in her office until the last minute. A former marketing director from her company, who admitted I had helped review pitch decks and edit investor briefs when time was tight. A neighbor who testified that I'd managed the house, the groceries, even helped Cassandra's aging parents when they visited for the holidays. Quiet things. Invisible things. The kind of contributions that never show up in bank statements but build the foundation of another person's success. Then came the therapists. 2 licensed psychologists reviewed patterns of control, detailing how emotional abuse doesn't always leave bruises. They talked about the dismissive language Cassandra used, the way she chipped away at my self-worth, how she isolated me from decisions even though I was the one keeping her world from collapsing behind the scenes. They quoted from texts she'd sent, messages we'd submitted into evidence, where she belittled me, mocked my work, and weaponized guilt like a tool. I didn't cry. I didn't look at her. I just sat there, listening as someone finally gave shape to the thing I hadn't been able to name for years. The slow erosion. The quiet humiliation. The way love turns into leverage when one person decides the other is no longer useful. When Gordon finally stood to defend the original agreement, he looked shaken. He talked fast, filling space with legal jargon, citing clauses and insisting everything had been fair, that I had signed willingly, that the $50,000 was a generous gesture. Judge Goldstein raised her hand once, silencing him mid-sentence, then asked one question. Do you consider this agreement equitable given the financial and emotional circumstances presented? He hesitated. It was barely a second, but it was enough. She looked back at the papers in front of her, and in a voice that didn't rise in volume but still seemed to shake the air, she delivered her decision. This agreement is hereby voided on the grounds of coercion, lack of legal representation, and gross inequity. A full financial reassessment will be ordered, and Mr. Blake is entitled to full discovery of shared marital assets. Cassandra didn't flinch, but I saw it, the way her shoulders pulled tight, the way her lips pressed into a line so thin it nearly disappeared. Gordon leaned toward her, whispering something she didn't seem to hear. She was still staring straight ahead, face perfectly still, but I knew that look. It was the look of someone who just realized they'd made a critical miscalculation. As we stood and gathered our things, Deborah placed one hand on my arm, just for a moment. No smile. Just a nod. Outside, the sky was still dry and cloudless, the same as it had been every day since this began. But something was different. The weight I'd been carrying wasn't gone, not completely, but it had shifted. I wasn't Cassandra's shadow anymore. I wasn't the man left with a check and a motel room and a name no one remembered. I was someone who had stood up, who had said no, who had been heard. And the fight wasn't over. Not yet. But this time, it was on even ground. The verdict came 3 weeks after the courtroom, delivered not with a dramatic bang, but with the quiet, clinical precision of a legal document that changed everything. It arrived on a Monday morning, emailed to Deborah and hand-delivered to my temporary apartment just a few hours later by a paralegal who looked far too calm for someone carrying the final chapter of a war. I sat at my small kitchen table, hand steady, eyes fixed on the first few lines. It didn't feel like a victory, not at first. It felt like a long, slow exhale after holding my breath for months, maybe years. Judge Goldstein's decision was exact, thorough, and written with a clarity that cut through every lie Cassandra and Gordon had tried to bury me under. Cassandra was ordered to pay $450,000 in spousal support, not some shallow gesture or temporary relief, but a statement, a recognition of the years I'd spent supporting her, not just emotionally but functionally, practically, in every way that didn't show up on tax returns. She'd made the argument that I hadn't earned anything. The court disagreed. Our marital assets, the sprawling Scottsdale estate, the brokerage accounts, the vehicles, the art she used to buy to impress guests and then forget in unused rooms, were divided evenly, 50-50, without compromise. That part hit her hardest. Cassandra had always treated money like armor, like identity. She wore it in the brand she draped herself in the car she insisted on upgrading every 18 months, in the friends she surrounded herself with, the ones who orbited power and status like moths. Watching her lose half of everything she thought was hers by birthright wasn't about revenge. It was about balance finally being restored. When the numbers were tallied, I walked away with just under $3 million from the marriage itself. Not a cent of it touched the inheritance. That remained sealed, protected, untouched under my name and mine alone. Deborah had ensured it. My mother's legacy stayed pure, not a bargaining chip, not a weapon, not something Cassandra could sink her claws into. It had been meant for a different kind of salvation, and I kept it that way. Cassandra didn't say a word during the final proceeding. She sat stiff in her chair, eyes forward, jaw locked. She didn't look at me, and I didn't look for her gaze. There was nothing left between us that required eye contact. I didn't need to see regret or anger or disbelief. I already knew what this was doing to her, not just financially, but emotionally. For someone like Cassandra, this wasn't about money. It was about being challenged, exposed, made vulnerable. And I had done it without raising my voice, without slinging mud, without turning this into a spectacle. I'd let the truth speak for itself. That, more than anything, was the real victory. Afterwards, outside the courthouse, I stood for a while near the steps. The Phoenix heat was in full swing, the pavement shimmering in the distance. Reporters lingered, though no one approached me directly. There had been whispers, of course, murmurs about the CEO whose clean, manicured life had been turned inside out by the man she'd once called embarrassing. But I didn't give interviews. I didn't need to. The story was written in court filings now, official and permanent. The thing people never tell you about these moments is how quiet they are. There's no soundtrack, no swelling music, no applause. Just the sound of traffic in the distance, a breeze that does nothing to ease the heat, and the strange, surreal lightness that comes with finally, irrevocably being free. I thought about that day, the one where I stood outside a forgotten bank branch with a duffel bag and a cracked ATM card, with nothing in my name but a final whisper from my mother and the last dregs of pride. I had no idea, then, what was waiting behind that screen. What door I was about to unlock. I didn't know that within a month, I would not only reclaim my life, but tear down the false image Cassandra had built over years, the one where I was just an accessory to her success. Now she would never be able to speak about her career, her empire, her story without my name shadowing it. But the real triumph wasn't what I took from her. It was what I reclaimed from myself. Dignity, voice, presence, and a future that was finally, entirely mine. 6 months later, my life looked nothing like the version I'd once believed was permanent. And thank God for that. The noise had quieted, not just around me, but inside me. For the first time in years, I wasn't flinching at shadows or second-guessing my value in someone else's life. I'd found stillness again, and in that stillness, I rediscovered the parts of myself that had been buried under years of subtle dismissal, emotional erosion, and silence disguised as compromise. I was teaching again. Not because I needed the money, not anymore, but because it had always been the one thing that made me feel aligned. Realigned, even. Like I was finally back where I belonged. My classroom was smaller than the one I used to have, the desks a little more worn, but it didn't matter. The first day back, I stood at the front of the room with a fresh stack of novels and a lesson plan on the board, and I felt something click back into place. Teaching wasn't a fallback. It was a calling. I never stopped loving it, I just stopped thinking I deserved to hold on to things I loved. I moved into a quiet apartment just north of Phoenix, perched on the edge of a ridge where the mountains turned gold in the early mornings. It wasn't huge, but it was mine. No alarms I didn't set, no rooms curated for strangers I didn't know. Just bookshelves filled with paperbacks I'd kept over the years, a French press that hissed each morning with the kind of ritual comfort I didn't know I needed, and wide windows that opened to silence. Peace wasn't a luxury anymore. It was the baseline. I reached out to my brother again, something I hadn't done in too long. Cassandra never said outright that she didn't like him, but her coldness was enough to create space where connection should have been. Same with friends, old colleagues, even my former principal. She hadn't needed to tell me to distance myself. I'd just slowly let it happen, one missed call at a time, until my world revolved entirely around her approval. It turns out people don't disappear. They wait. And when I called, they answered. It was one of those early spring afternoons that belong only to Arizona, light breeze, sun warm but not cruel, the air just dry enough to make you grateful for shade, when I found myself back in the same cafe where I had first met Cassandra years ago. I hadn't planned it. I just needed somewhere quiet to grade papers. The place hadn't changed much. Still the same smell of espresso and wood polish, the same creaky chairs, the same handwritten chalkboard menus that never got updated. But this time, the memory didn't sting. It didn't weigh me down. I didn't sit in the same corner. I just took a spot by the window and let it be another place again. She was sitting 2 tables over, tapping furiously at a laptop that kept freezing. I noticed her frustration before I even looked at her, the kind of half-laugh people make when they're about to throw something, followed by a resigned sigh. Normally I wouldn't have said anything. But something in the way she smiled at her own misfortune, a kind of self-aware, exhausted honesty, made me ask if she needed help. She laughed and said, "Only if you're better with tech than I am, which isn't a high bar." Her name was Lauren. She was a nurse, recently divorced, just trying to finish a continuing education module before her next shift. Her screen was frozen mid-quiz. I fixed it in 2 minutes, mostly by closing out the 15 browser tabs she had open and restarting her machine. She offered to buy me a coffee, and I accepted. We ended up talking for over 2 hours. About work. About burnout. About how people can love you and still erase you if you let them. She was kind. No pretense. No performance. Just calm, warm conversation with someone who wasn't trying to be anywhere else but there. When she finally stood to leave, she wrote her number on a napkin and smiled, not flirtatious, just sincere. I folded it carefully and slipped it into my wallet. And without really thinking, I placed it next to the old ATM card. The one that had once felt like a last resort. Now it felt like a talisman. Not because of what it unlocked, but because of what it reminded me. My mother's legacy was never the money. It was the message she left behind, written in the spaces between her words, in the patience she taught me without saying a thing. You are allowed to start over. You are allowed to demand more. And sometimes, the world has to burn down around you before you finally see the foundation you were standing on was never solid to begin with. Sometimes you have to lose everything to finally understand your own worth. And I had.